wrong to not mention that somewhere along the line.
So we are ticking the box
as well.
Hmm?
You've got to mention Google Bard as well. That's
Bloody awful. No, I don't have to mention it. It's a competing product.
So we'll stick with Microsoft products, and
Yeah.
without further ado, Tom, take it away.
So thank you very much, Flavio. And yeah, I think when Flavio says very experienced, he's just being polite. He actually just means old. So yeah, just a little bit about me. Yeah, so 20 plus years in the IT sector. Most of that has been spent in the world of data analytics and BI and so on, but also ever more having to deal with how we go about using artificial intelligence. And I mean, obviously, at the moment, we are still talking about sort of quite narrow, specialized artificial intelligences. So we're not talking about something that would work in sort of general as like a Skynet or anything like that as yet. Although I'm sure it is only a matter of time. But we also want to just sort of talk a little bit about what we do initially when we're working with any kind of machine learning or AI, and the things we actually have to consider in order to get to a point where we have a data set that we can do something with and actually meaningfully use some sort of machine learning and AI with it. So really, the beginning point of this is collecting the data we want to use. I mean, that's a fairly standard requirement of any kind of analysis or BI. We have to actually get the data we want to analyze. Second step is really about preparing that data and cleansing it, although that's obviously going to be a really simple job because we all know all our data sets are absolutely perfect and we don't need to do anything with it. If we were going to actually build our own machine learning models, though, we do need to actually choose which model we're going to use. So dependent on what we're trying to get out of AI or machine learning, we do need to think about an appropriate model to use. There's no use using a classification model if what we're trying to do is find an anomaly as such, because it's not necessarily the right way of doing it. Or indeed, if we're trying to do something that is more of a statistical regression type model, there's no use using k-means, which would be a good way of finding an anomaly. So we do need to choose an appropriate model. Thing is, there's usually going to be several different appropriate models we can use. So you have to put some thought into the different ways you can approach it and try things out. And it's important that you can actually experiment with these things and work through it that way. We then start passing our historical data in to train our model. Now, when you've got a load of historical data, you'll need to partition that off, send some of it to use for training, some of it to use to validate the predictions that start to come out of the model when you start to actually use it for predictive purposes. And then we can evaluate what's working, what isn't, and from there there's further tuning we can do to improve the speed of it, improve the accuracy of the predictions, and that's how it's a parameter tuning step. Once we've gone through all of this, we have a model that we can make available somewhere and start to use. And the main thrust of what I'm going to be covering today is really about how we actually use it, rather than talking about too much how we go about training it. So hopefully I haven't dwelt on the overview and preparation too long there. But I did promise some ChatGPT in here. So what does ChatGPT say when I start asking it questions? And I was asking it questions today because I was thinking, well, if I can ask the right questions of ChatGPT, I'm not going to have to write my own slides. It didn't do too badly. I asked it first of all, how do I use AI in Power BI? And it came out with a bunch of stuff that broadly, I could have got off Google, but if you just Google that, you're going to be inundated with web pages. And what this has actually done here, and I was actually quite pleased with the outcome of this, I really wasn't expecting it to be as good as this, that it gave me quite a nice little précis of what you can do. The thing I particularly wanted to talk about tonight, though, was using cognitive services, which is an Azure service, and using that inside of Power BI. So I asked it that, and it gave a rough explanation of how you can actually do the integration. So it wouldn't replace actually going off and learning how to do this properly, but that is not a bad overview of the demo I'm actually going to show in a minute. So, and then as a final thing, just asked it to make these into a couple of actual PowerPoint slides. And it did actually summarize it quite nicely about the things that we can do. There's a few things I do want to highlight here about some of the stuff that is in there just straight out of the box around key influencers and decomposition trees that are basically, they are AI-driven visuals that you can almost immediately just drag and drop into your Power BI reports. I'm sure you've probably seen some of these. You may even have tried them, played with them, and you might even be using them for real. And of course, we can also build custom machine learning models, which is really where I came in. And once you've got that custom machine learning model, that will have an endpoint that you can call from a Power Query and go and call that function in there to go and make predictions off the back of what you've got in your custom AI model. So anything I go through today will broadly be applicable to how you can use that for a custom model and not just with the pre-built cognitive services models. And of course, we've got features in there as well, like AutoML that you can use inside of a data flow, and that can sort of automatically select and build and train a model. And if you want to start to dabble in AI, that's probably a great place to start. But it may not be everything you want it to be. And again, the second slide is just what it came up with for the how we go about using cognitive services, but this will be the subject of the demo. So again, it's not done a bad job here. So we're now going to move away from something that ChatGPT has done for me, and now you're going to see how bad my own slides are in comparison. So really, yeah, how can we go about using this, and what are our problems and limitations of what we've got there? So I mentioned first off the AI tools that we can use in data flows, and one of the problems that we do have is that requires a premium license. So that can have quite a significant cost impact on what you're doing. If you haven't got a premium license, or if that is not something that would work for your size of organization, then you probably need to start thinking about other ways you can try to use that. The AI-powered visuals, of course, are very limited in scope because they'll do one specific thing. And when we start into custom integration and custom models, you really start to need to know what you're doing with machine learning. So again, if you've started with something like AutoML, then moving on to a more significant piece of machine learning work is probably a smaller barrier at that point. But again, so there's these various barriers, but probably the big service that has a lot of things in it already that you can make fairly immediate use of is cognitive services. And cognitive services is a set of pre-built, pre-trained AI models. So it's got a whole load of capability that you can just use straight out of the box. You don't need to go off and train your own models here. So if you've got sort of audio data, that can be passed into a cognitive services endpoint to convert that into from speech to text or text to speech. It's also got capabilities around translation and language recognition, and it can do speaker detection. So you will possibly have seen some demos whereby on some of the transcriptions on things you can start to pick up different speakers speaking bits as it transcribes things, and it can actually do some of that detection for you. Some of the stuff we're going to look at more particularly today is around the language API, and we're going to talk about the sentiment analysis and key phrase extraction particularly tonight, and that will be the focus of the demo. But you've got other functionality in there around question answering and things like that, and again, that kind of functionality starts to relate back to the capability that ChatGPT has. And we've also got in there sort of vision analysis. So if your data contains images, in theory, you could push those through a Power Query into an endpoint. I probably wouldn't recommend trying because it's likely to grind to a complete halt very quickly. So I think if you need to start doing that sort of visual recognition and using those sorts of APIs, you're going to be heading very quickly into the realm of custom development, because I don't think you're going to get very much speed out of doing this through a Power Query. But I think in theory, you could deal with the binary data and pass that into the API. But yeah, don't do it on a lot of rows at once. And then, yeah, we've also got some anomaly detection work in there, and we have the ability to do some content moderation and provide personalization in different experiences as well. And then lastly, we have the OpenAI service, which is where we can use cognitive services to call into ChatGPT. But again, this is a relatively recent addition, so I haven't really got I've not a working demo for that one at the moment. It will come in the future, I'm sure. So, any questions before I go on to the demonstration? Cool.
Well, the session has been recorded, yeah? Yeah.
Okay, so switching my back on. The starting point that we need is a couple of custom functions that we can put into our Power Query. And essentially, we're going to paste these into a blank query inside of Power BI. I'm putting this up like this at the moment because, as you can see, the first declaration there does involve putting in your API keys. Now, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to show you my API keys on the screen and have that recorded and passed around everywhere. So I am just going to show you this. I've then, in classic Blue Peter fashion, got one I made earlier where I've already created these functions, so you don't have to go off and do that. But broadly, what these functions are doing is at the top, you're defining your key and your endpoint. Your endpoint will be what you've created when you go into Azure and create your AI service. So you go into create a new cognitive services service, and when you've got that in there, that's provisioned. That will give you an endpoint and it will give you the keys. So you fill in those details up there, and then it just adds a few bits of headers in there and essentially adds the text that we're going to pass into this function into a payload of the of that endpoint, so that becomes the payload. It's formatted into a JSON string. It passes all that in, and the function will then return either the sentiment or the key phrases, depending on what we are asking for at any given point. So moving over to the Power BI file and going into transform data, you'll see already I've created the two functions in there so that I can actually go in there and do this without having to reveal my keys to everybody and create a security incident for us. So the next thing I'm going to do here is add a new data source. So what I've got here is a very simple CSV file, and it's only a very small amount of data I've got in here. Because we're not using this to train a model, what we're doing is consuming a pre-trained model. So we don't need the massive data sets that you would need if you wanted to create and train your own new model. We are just using it to make a call, make a prediction, make a decision on our data for us and help us to see what's going on in that data. So I'm just going to very quickly load that data in. Just as an aside, you may find that sometimes these things don't understand certain British idiom. So dependent on how you might phrase something, there are certain phrases that may sound more or less negative in British English that will come out both as negative when you put it through here. I'm not going to put it through here because it's going to upset it if we upload it to YouTube. But suffice to say, the one I tried earlier, one version of it began with the word dogs, and whether it had dogs at the front or not, it treated it both as negative phrases, where we would probably in British idiom treat one as positive, one as negative. So yeah, avoiding the swear words so that we don't get in trouble on YouTube when we upload this later. So what I've got here is really just a set of comments, and it's really the comment text that we are interested in here. So this is something where we've just got a load of text from users, and we might want to know what the so we might want to know where what the key phrases are in there, or what the sentiment of that comment actually is. If I remember rightly, the sentiment can return positive, negative, or neutral. I'm feeling there's a fourth option, but I can't remember what it is. But generally, positive, negative, neutral is generally going to be sufficient for us. So what I'm going to do here is invoke these custom functions against this data. So under add column, we want to call this one sentiment, and we'll pass that to sentiment, and it's picked up automatically that I probably want to use the comment text on there. And it will ask you to set your privacy on your data sources as well. So what we've got here, you'll see we've added that column at the end. Mixed was the other option. That was the one I was trying to remember. So this gives us an analysis of what it thinks the general sentiment of these comments is. Now, whether or not you agree with that general sentiment is another question, but rather than you having to go through and make that analysis and make that call, that's quite a different matter. So you don't need to be as concerned about having somebody make a judgment. It's not necessarily an unbiased judgment. Let's be clear about that, because whatever any AI model does can still be biased. It can only ever be as unbiased as the data set that it was trained on. And that's something to always bear in mind, that these things are not infallible. They're not magic. It's what you've put in is where it gets to its decision in the end. However, the one thing you can be sure of is that its decision is likely to be consistent in a way that a human decision is unlikely to be. And the other thing we want to do here is we will invoke the other custom function for the key phrases, and we'll use the key phrases function for that. And we want to apply that to comment as well. So there we go. We've got all of those elements now brought into that query. So I'm going to just close and apply at that point. So this will now give us a data set that we've enriched with two different cognitive services functions. So it's very, very simple. Essentially just copying and pasting some fairly, I suppose, cookie cutter type code that we've made some small adaptations to, and we've done a little bit of processing on it. It spits out those functions, and we can see something else from it. So just to give you a little bit of a demonstration of what this has actually done with our data, the first thing I'm going to do is just show you a word cloud with the comments field in it. So the word cloud is a custom visual that I've pulled in just for the purposes of demonstrating this. So if we put values into there, hopefully this is going to do something. I'm hoping.
Maybe add it to the category.
Is it back count? No, what am I doing here?
I think it might need something in the category. Yeah.
There we go. Sorry, that's me forgetting how to use the visual. So when you're using visuals and you're doing demos of visuals, make sure you remember how to use them before you start showing people. But taking a quick look at that, you've got a fair amount of pure gibberish up there. You can't see anything that's going on with those comments out of that lot. So, you know, that's not going to be a thing that's actually useful to you there. There is a setting on this, if I can remember where it is, that helps us to stop words. We can switch the default stop words on, and slightly better, but still we're not talking about something that you can really see much from. If we just move this a bit out of the way, and I stick another word cloud on there, and this time drop our key phrases into there, you do start to see a little bit more of something out of that. You still will want to do some messing around with it, but you are starting to see a thing where it's actually extracting some of the more important words out of what's going on here. So you'll see in here, the word fumbling suddenly starts to get much more important, where You can see it in the upper one, but it's much less clear. So you can start to see. So if you were analysing something like your Trustpilot reviews, then that would be a way of starting to see where you've really got problems. So you might have a whole load of 1-star Trustpilot reviews, which isn't necessarily helpful because in and of itself, that won't tell you necessarily where the problems are. Whereas if you start to look at your poorer feedback, you can then start to see what the keywords are on that poorer feedback. So let's just try that. I will just get rid of that one because we don't. Do we care about that? No, we probably still do for the now. So what we can do here. Oh, this is slow today. This is the trouble sometimes with custom visuals. They're not always the fastest things in the world. So what I'm going to do here is just stick a slicer in, if I can find where the slicer is. There it is. And I'm going to stick the sentiment into that slicer. So if we look at our negative, again, you start to see more of a pattern, and there are words sort of coming up much more clearly when we start to analyse what's going on behind our negative reviews. Whereas hopefully we'll see something different when we go to positive. So you suddenly don't see the word fumbling so much.
See, doghouse.
Yeah, not sure where some of these come from, but yeah, you can see how those two bits of analysis can work together in terms of how you can actually go about analysing things like review data, as I say, where you might have a bunch of 1-star reviews because you sent out a load of product during a postal strike and nothing got delivered on time. That's probably something you couldn't control so well, except you could probably have communicated that better. So that gives you a means of starting to actually act on what the feedback is. Or if you're getting a lot of good reviews, you can start to pick out what things you're doing right, so you can try to do more of it. Other than that, I can just show you quickly just some of the comments with the sentiment beside them, just tabulating those. So you just get a very simple, stick a very simple table together. But yeah, you can start to see the comments being made about various things here, and sort of get a feel for the positives and negatives. Yeah, so that's yeah. There's the mention of the doghouse. Absolutely no idea what any of that is supposed to actually mean, but these are sample comments that are from the one of the national Microsoft companies of Fabricam. So I think people just make up a load of stuff for these to just give some sample data for people to work with. So I think that broadly covers what I was going to try to demonstrate there. But as I say, the mechanism I'm using to call the API endpoint for cognitive services would be broadly the same mechanism as if you'd written a machine learning model in Azure ML Studio and published it. You would be using broadly the same mechanism to call that, send it the data, and get your responses back. So this means you can actually start to integrate into cognitive services without needing a premium capacity. Of course, if you have got a premium capacity, then going and doing this in data flows is going to be probably the simplest way you can actually integrate this. But if you don't have premium capacity, or if you need to do something that is a little bit more complicated, and you need to do a bit more processing of the responses, then this would be a very good way of actually doing that integration for you. So, does anybody have any questions at that point? Claudia.
Could you please go back to Power Query? You
Sure.
did something interesting there, and I was wondering if you could change the output of those functions. So when you showed us this, one of the columns on the table. Go to the right, please. So I think it was the second comment. It says, "Can't believe you pulled sheet with the wrong items again." Then you can see what it says doesn't matter. But then the sentiment is mixed. Where I would expect that to be clearly negative. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. My point is, if you didn't agree with the sentiment that's spitting out, could you change this function?
There's very little you can do to change the inbuilt cognitive services functions. They are built in and trained on that. I think where that's coming in at mixed is probably related to.
Yeah, there's more text in there.
Yeah, and I think it's the. Yeah, if you weren't the only, and the way sometimes this is worded, and and again, this is possibly slightly a foible of the English language, of course, is that sometimes we can say we have that whole sort of damning with faint praise thing, like I would have stopped ordering a long time ago if you weren't the only people who made it. Well, depending on how you word that exactly, that can come across as not necessarily as negative as it's meant.
Yeah.
And you said there's limited sort of things you can do with those pre-built models. What are those limited things that you can do with them?
I would have to look that up in the documentation.
But there is something you can actually change, because I was thinking, my question was like, actually get sort of completely eliminate sort of aspect of positive, negative, and neutral.
And there are some limited parameters on these. There's a lot of different endpoints. I couldn't off the top of my head tell you what is possible with any of them, but most of the cognitive services, that's a horrible sentence, do take some additional parameters to say to use different versions of models and things like that. So there may be things that you can do, but it's going to be extremely limited.
You said there's always going to be a difference between British English and American English.
Yes, and that's always, and depending on whether it's been trained on British or American English, is going to have an effect on what you're doing. To us,
I can remember using sentiment analysis a couple of years ago, and it's a while since I've used it, but it output at that time a decimal between 0 and 1, depending on whether it was a positive or negative analysis of text. Does it still do that, or has it been replaced by this?
I think it's been replaced, but you might be able to call older versions of the modelling to do that. The lady at the back.
But you said that it just trains it on the data set, because that the data set only model that you use data.
Okay, so the question was whether you could retrain the data set and how it works. You don't get the option to retrain cognitive services data sets. They are, cognitive services AI models. They are something that Microsoft have built and Microsoft have trained. So it is Microsoft that train them. I think that there are sometimes different versions of models, so there might be things that are better fit for what you're doing, but yeah, this is one of those times where you're essentially letting somebody else go and do that decision making for you, and you are losing that control because you can't put your own data set in to train it. The upside is that these will have been trained usually on a much bigger data set than you could ever manage to muster for yourself. So it's it's a different matter there.
Keep updating the data though, continuously, was it just a static data set?
So yeah, as far as I know, it is, they do regularly retrain, and part of the point with anything that is based around AI and machine learning is that it will be relearning and retraining on as new data is passed through it. So the idea is that it would be doing that over time.
But you get different results.
Yes. So yeah, that, I suppose that is a warning, and again, this is a warning with anything AI related. Your results are not deterministic. You will not guarantee the same result given the same input every time. So that is something to be aware of. Potentially, if the model if the model hasn't changed since the last between times you make that call, it will probably come out with the same response each time. But certainly, given that the idea is that these should evolve over time, that is by no means guaranteed. So yeah, do be aware that this is not a deterministic result. Like, what day is it on the 20th of what day of the week is the 20th of April 2023? That will always come out as Thursday.
Potentially interesting. Quick question. Do we, the models are trained on a bias? Do we get a definition of the bias, or I suppose the scope in which the data model was trained on?
Okay, so the question is, how much do we know about the data that it was trained on?
Yeah.
Not a whole lot, if I'm honest, that I can find at any rate. That's not to say that it isn't out there somewhere, but I've not found that much information on it. Now, as I've said, that does then carry with it all sorts of risks about bias, because dependent on the data set it was trained on, that can send you down a whole load of rabbit holes. One of the classic ones was to do with image recognition and trying to train a model to recognize Arctic foxes. And it turned out that what the model was recognizing was anything that looked a bit like a fox on a white background. So if you gave it a normal fox in the middle of a snowy field, it goes, Arctic fox, fox on snow, Arctic fox. Similarly, again, because of the training data set that went into it, was a system to try to recognize skin cancers. And it turned out it was actually recognizing the presence of a ruler beside a mole. So whenever it saw the ruler, it went, that's probably something cancerous. But that was because those photos are something that the doctors were interested in, and were often the cancers. But because they always had a ruler in the photos of the cancers, it was actually detecting a ruler, not detecting anything about the skin lesion. So again, that's one of the big dangers of trust around this. So I could probably do a very long piece on the ethics and pitfalls of AI if anyone was ever interested, because it's a huge topic, and these are huge risks in it. And as it gets more pervasive in our everyday lives, we need to be aware of it. Norman, did you have a?
That's my question, really.
Oh, okay.
Don't they make the data sets they train publicly available?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the idea would be to make, but as Norman says there, I think the idea would be to make publicly available those data sets, so that you can at least try to get some understanding of the bias that might be in there.
Are the ones that are trained, sort of have a theme of around evaluation, so I can see this being really useful in analysing evaluation feedback from training? Are the data sets, are the models that have been trained on that kind of?
Okay, so the question there was about models being trained on evaluation feedback from training courses. I don't think there was anything quite that specific on it. However, I think a lot of the things around sort of sentiment and key phrase would probably, to a large degree, meet your use case there. And there are some other bits of some of the other text analysis endpoints that might be of interest. So I would probably recommend having a little dig through the documentation and just seeing, if you go to the Azure Cognitive Services website, it does give you quite a good overview of what's available there. And I think probably some of the language stuff would be the things you'd be interested in for that purpose. But I think some of that would be, I would go down the route of using the more generic ones, partly because they'll be trained on bigger data sets anyway. And you know, what you're generally wanting to get out of them will be things around key phrases and sentiment, and you'll start to get a little bit more. I think you'll be able to get a fair bit out of those APIs without it needing to be completely specific to training, because the technique and what it's trying to predict is going to be the same, whether it is training evaluations, whether it is your personal development review at work, whether it is product reviews or customer services reviews on Trustpilot or on TripAdvisor or whatever.
A follow-up question. So I'm assuming that you can bring your custom models if you know how to train one. And if that's the case, is there a cost to do so here?
But the cost will be, well, and the cost with cognitive services as well. I mean, you've up to 5,000 calls a month. You get for free, but beyond that, you are having to start to pay for your consumption of cognitive services. Similarly, yeah, if you've built and trained your custom model, deployed that, again, it's a consumption-based cost that you will be dealing with there. So again, depending on how many calls you're making to the API, so the API you pay for rather than anything Power BI related, because it's the API where the cost is on this way of doing it. I'm not sure what the details are when you call these from a data flow. I would need to look that up in terms of pricing, but you'll probably still have to pay for the API and your premium capacity. So it's going to get pricey.
Thanks.
Sorry, what would count as a call? Is it every row here?
Yeah, so the question there is what would count as a call. So it's every row and every column of value. So essentially down here, I've got 20 rows. When I ran that data, I made 40 calls. So that would count 40 towards my free capacity for this month. Any more for any more?
Now, the question is a bit off topic. So, I know Microsoft have rolled out that Copilot on Word and Excel and PowerPoint. Do you think it's coming to Power BI? The Copilot? The integration with ChatGPT.
Oh, right. Sorry. So Copilot is the ChatGPT integration. I haven't heard anything, but that I would be surprised if they don't. Let's put it that. I think it is one of those things that, and I think particularly where where ChatGPT might actually have a role inside of Power BI would be on helping you write some of the DAX query or DAX expressions and some of your Power Query, because I mean I can see in the long run something like quick measures being completely replaced by some sort of AI/ChatGPT style functionality in it, because you'd be able to do an awful lot more with a quick measure that you could generate by saying, I need a measure that does da 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 da, and it spits out your DAX for you, and then you tweak that, rather than the more limited predefined list that you're always going to get in quick measures and stuff like that. So I think that's something where I think it will come. I don't know of any specific plans from Microsoft at this stage, but I can see ChatGPT integration or similar appearing across the entire stack one way or another. I can see it coming to Visual Studio in the future as well, and SQL Management Studio and all of that. I don't see an area where we won't get AI helping us and having some sort of AI helper like that.
If I can add to that, so in the first event, we had the Microsoft Product Manager in Power BI presenting. They said, talking about AI, that some things are too confidential, they might slip it into the product and never tell us. Improvements to, I don't know, the automatic DAX builder, for example. Is already based in AI, perhaps ChatGPT, but they might not advertise that, it's highly confidential. So they don't want the competition to know they're sleeping that stuff in there. So I think they will tell us when they want us to know, but perhaps some of the stuff we see here are already has embedded some of that AI capability.
Not that they have any competition.
Any more for any more? Okay, then, well, shall we wrap up at that? Obviously, don't forget about the next event in May. What date was that, Flavio? 18th of May. That's at the yeah. And I can definitely recommend, because I know John's speaking at that, aren't you? I don't know the other speaker, but I've seen John speak before, and I know that his whatever he's doing definitely be worth seeing. So definitely try and get along to that if you possibly can, because it will be good.
No, Tom, thank you so much for that. That was really good.
No problem at all.
Fine, but yeah, guys, thank you all so much for coming along. There's a bit more pizza if anyone's still peckish outside. There's a couple more drinks, but yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you at the next event. Our office is in May. Yeah, thank you all so much.